This Ferrari was supposed to be the solution. Instead, it created a new, countless amount of problems. It was supposed to fulfill a childhood dream, but it quickly turned into my nightmare. And while I tried to stay optimistic through every one of its issues, I was only kidding myself while wasting my own sanity. This is the worst Ferrari I've ever bought, potentially one of the worst cars I've ever bought, but upon arrival it seemed the opposite. It closely matched what I saw in the auction photos, and while there were a few cosmetic issues inside and out, they were no big deal. You see, this car was listed with just normal wear and nothing else. Because of this, the price was pretty normal. I can't tell you that I got it for an absolute steal or that it was too cheap to pass up. This seemed to be the right car at the right time. My personal poster car has always been a red Ferrari 360 coupe, and even though I have a convertible one of these that's been a continual project, I figured it would be cool to finally get one that was mechanically proper so I could enjoy it while I took my time working on any of its little blemishes. Now, the transporter told me before he arrived that he couldn't get it started, so I came prepared. I figured it probably just had a dead battery from sitting at the auction for a while. Let's see. They said it wouldn't run. Hopefully I didn't just lock myself in here permanently. So, immobilizer. Put the key in. Put my foot over on the brake. Started right up. Seems to run all right too. I brought all those tools. Thought this was gonna be dramatic. Honestly, this car has seen better days, but it is not bad at all. This is common. Missing headliner, simple fix. This is an expensive fix, but simple fix. Leather everywhere. Oh, these are a little bit ratty, but again, stuff that we could fix all this. This is a nice car, and that's as long as it goes into drive and drives off this trailer. And it drove right off the truck perfectly without any drama. It stayed idling, and so far I was very pleased, but that would all change in just a few seconds. Now, considering this Ferrari traveled all the way from the opposite side of the country, the delivery process was smooth. So smooth, in fact, you would have thought it was arranged on stamps.com, which is the one stop for all your shipping necessities. Whether you're sending a steering knuckle or an old-fashioned belt buckle, all you have to do is input the address and package info, pick your rate. You can even order supplies and schedule a pickup, and you can truly do it all without leaving the house or office with stamps.com. And if you're used to those over-the-counter rates, you'll be amazed at the difference in price because stamps.com offers an up to 89% discount through UPS and USPS. To bypass that line at the post office, you really don't need a lot, just a scale and a printer and to visit stamps.com/samcrack. Heck, they're going to give you the scale for free along with a 4-week trial and some free postage to get you started when you visit stamps.com/samcrack. There is no reason to stand in line to pay more for the same exact services that you'll find over at stamps.com/samcrack. After a quick once-over, everything looked pretty clean, but almost too clean. The engine bay was clearly, freshly detailed. Areas that would usually just be a little dirty were spotless. In the front, I found the leather headliner, and of course, it was missing the original Ferrari toolkit. But like I said earlier, I was just excited to drive this car, and so I did. And the noise I heard within the first 20 seconds in killed any of that excitement. Let's listen. The This noise, which happens upon deceleration, sounds like an extremely sad string instrument. Now the truth is, I knew darn well what was wrong here, as there's a light on the dashboard for low coolant, which goes along with a common failure item on these cars that causes complete transmission failure. But I just didn't want to believe it to be the case, so I checked everything else beforehand. I started by putting the rear end up off the ground and drove it to see if the noise continued. This was really just a waste of time. Then I checked the transmission mount, because if it were collapsed, it would rub against the frame and create a bit of noise and harshness, but it wouldn't really sound anything like this. So now it was time to face reality and check the gear oil. To do this, you remove the rear bumper, which allows you access to the transmission drain hole. Keeping with the theme of Ferrari being a pain, the under tray is in the way of the drain plug, which is right here. We're just going to kind of hold this down and guide it right into our drain pan here. Oh, yeah, that's what happened, look. It has to be the source of our wine there. Somebody decided to put gravy in the gearbox. That is not the appropriate color there. What's happening is that the oil cooler, or I should say the transmission gear cooler, has broken, and it's mixing coolant with the gear oil, and of course, you know, the viscosity changes. And I would also imagine that, I don't know what's going to be in this overflow tank, but yeah, you see it's mucky in there? It's the problem. So you can actually visualize what is going on here. I've got the spare Ferrari 360 engine with the manifold stripped off of it, and you can see directly on top of the block sits this little canister, which is your transmission cooler. Now the outlet from the water pump and thermostat housing runs straight to this cooler, and if we look inside of it, you can see kind of this honeycomb pattern here. Those open passages is where your coolant is going to flow, and all that closed off area, well, that's where the gear oil is going to be sent through these lines that run off the gearbox. The metals used inside this cooler are known to weaken over time, and they will corrode, especially if you don't do routine coolant services on your Ferrari. And when they break apart, that allows the coolant and the gear oil to mix. The second that mixture enters your gearbox, it is a very short period of time before you'll experience a catastrophic failure. Every single failed transmission cooler I've ever heard of on this car has led to a failed transmission, and well, the only way you really discover this is through that noise we just heard. Now the cost to rebuild or replace a Ferrari 360 transmission is roughly 10 grand. At a shop, the price can well exceed this, but just figure that once you pull the transmission, you're likely going to replace all the wear items, the clutch, bearings, and seals. There's an expensive sensor in here, so it's hard to find a way around that price. A $10,000 repair bill will put me immediately upside down on this car, so it was tough to justify. Now, I'm used to buying project cars with problems at the auction, but generally at a steep discount. Like I mentioned, this car was listed with just normal wear, and the price reflected that. So my first thought was to notify the auction and let them know that this car was just not as described. I'll expand on this part a bit later, but the auction ended up being worse than useless. They constantly deflected, sending me to different people in different departments. They told me they'd follow up. They never really did. It was clear their motive was to keep the sale in place. After sending video clips of what we all just saw and heard, the last auction representative I spoke to literally asked, "How do you know it's not supposed to sound like that?" Since I knew I was stuck with it, I started with the path of least resistance. All right, let me show you what we got going on here. All the old mucky gear oil is out. I fitted a brand new filter here. This lists for about $125 at the dealer. I paid $75 online. Took a couple days to get here. And then right here, this is the recirculation tube, and then that is the fill hole where I have a funnel up there, and it is buried all the way in the engine bay there. I'm gonna put some generic gear oil that I have in it currently to kind of mix around. We're gonna drive it, we're gonna warm things up, and I am dying to know what this is gonna sound like just with the gear oil change. Now remember, of course, we did not fix the cooler that's in there, so I don't know how quickly it's mixing, but we should get a few miles of, you know, pretty well concentrated gear oil driving. I imagine it's not gonna change things much, but here we go. Oh yeah, It's still there. Real bad. Yeah, you can hear it grinding and juddering as you're shifting too. If I'm gonna fix this right, I would just need a good transmission to swap in. At the time, there were a few used gearboxes available for around $6,000 to $8,000, but I waited as I knew these trade hands pretty frequently, and the chance that I could save a few thousand being patient would likely happen, and it did. Several months later, just a few hours away from me, someone listed a transmission with a starting bid around $2,000, and nobody bid but me. Well, it never met reserve. I connected with the seller and was able to buy it from him for the $2,000. It was an incredible deal, and I ended up becoming good friends with the seller, Andrew. At the same time, he gave me the parts engine out of this same Ferrari. You see, he had a similar situation where he bought the same Ferrari, and just a little while into his ownership, the engine started running funny, and the local repair shop quoted him tens of thousands of dollars for a replacement engine. So he did the most logical thing. He ripped it all out and just stuck an LS in its place. This kicks a little harder than the stock one, man, I gotta tell you. So with the replacement transmission in tow, I was eager to swap things over. I've done this job once before and I figured it shouldn't take but a day or two to complete. But since I just heard about Andrew's Ferrari engine fiasco and I spent a little bit of time going over it and taking it apart, for some reason I thought it might be a good idea to compression test the engine in this car before we spend any more time and money swapping over the gearbox. Now, I had no reason to believe this car had anything majorly wrong with its engine. It always fired right over, it idled pretty good, and the few times I drove it, it always revved nice and sounded healthy. But what I was about to find would make my transmission issues almost irrelevant. $150. That sounds a bit low. I'll have to compare it with my other readings. For good measure, I just put the compression tester over to the passenger side on a random cylinder over there because I'm not liking the numbers I'm getting from the driver's side. Let's see what we got. 120. What the heck is going on? A healthy Ferrari 360 engine will read anywhere from around 180 to 200 psi. We're well below that threshold, and that's just on the first 3 cylinders. After checking all of them, the highest number I got was 160, with the lowest being around 100. Now, when this car arrived, the check engine light was on. When I scanned it, it just had some random misfire codes, which I never minded much attention because these codes are pretty common, and even though everything continued to snowball, I just didn't want to believe it. So I tried one last Hail Mary solution. First, I focused on our lowest compression cylinder and did a wet test. A wet compression test is when you take a little bit of oil and dump it down the cylinder before cranking the engine. If your number stays the same, it lets you know that the compression is escaping somewhere in the cylinder head or the top end. But if the number goes up, it points to an issue with the piston rings. They're not sealing against the cylinder like they should, causing compression to escape through the bottom end. When I did the wet test, the numbers immediately jumped. Now remember, at this point I'm still fighting reality, but I have never heard of a piston ring wearing on one of these engines, especially not at 30,000 miles. But in general, an engine that sits for a long time can develop a sticky piston ring, which can give you a low compression reading, even though it just needs to be unstuck. Usually running an engine, getting it warm will unstick a ring, but in some cases I've heard of using injector cleaner poured directly into the cylinder so it can break down any buildup around the ring and unstick it. Now, generally, when you hear of a case like this, it's usually just a single cylinder that's your outlier. In our case, we obviously have multiple bad numbers, so this is an extreme long shot, but I poured solvent into each cylinder and let them sit overnight. And you guessed it, nothing really changed. Well, except for the viscosity of our oil, with all the addition of the cleaner I put in the engine. So I didn't create any additional problems here. I immediately dumped the oil so we could start fresh. And the second I got my catch pan into the sunlight, it lit up. It looked like someone mixed a cup of glitter with this oil. Now remember, this car came with a pretty exceptionally clean engine bay, so I can only guess that somewhere inside there was a pretty pretty severe oil leak, and the owner of the car just continued driving it and completely ignored it. As your engine runs lower on oil, it runs hotter because that oil isn't there to displace the heat. With more heat becomes more friction, and with more friction there's just more wear. All that glitter is the bearings really just experiencing more friction than they should. And heck, that's probably the same thing that happened to our rings. They got worn, and now we've got low compression. So even though this engine was bad, it could have been much worse. It hadn't spun a bearing, there was no scoring on the cylinder walls. I mean, it was in rebuildable condition, but these Ferrari parts aren't cheap. Once you dismantle the entire engine to put on your new rings, well, you're going to want a new set of bearings, of course, and then every other little piece of hardware that goes along with an engine rebuild. You'll be right around the price of just going and buying a used engine. And this is something I actually did. At the time this all played out, I was a lot more tenacious, a lot more excited, and well, just a lot dumber. And that's a dangerous combo because you'll spend unnecessary sorts of money to chase a dream. Now, I didn't just buy any ordinary used engine. I bought the nicest used rebuilt engine I could find. It looked brand new. It was done by the guys over at Fur Parts, so it came with a guarantee. There was brand new cam belts and seals, and literally everything had been redone on this engine. And when it showed up, instead of looking at this engine for what it was, a beautiful refreshed Ferrari engine, I looked at it as one giant pile of cash. And that's when I really lost interest in ever fixing this car, because I started considering how much that engine cost. It was about 10 grand. Even though I got the transmission for a steal, how much is everything else going to cost to make that right? And well, the engine was just the short block, so how many new parts am I going to throw at it? One of those transmission coolers I showed you earlier cost about $1,000 by itself. So there's a lot of little pieces and parts that add $1,000 here and there to a Ferrari build, and it started to get to the point where I might as well just go out and buy a new Ferrari. It was getting ridiculous. Now, all this happened a while back, over a pretty long span of time. It was this time that helped diminish my interest in this project, but also this time helped buy me out of the car. With all the recent inflation and collector car boom, even junk specialty cars were worth way more than they were just a few years ago. So I was able to sell this Ferrari to a wholesaler with the disclosure for just a small loss. If I would have sold this directly after I got it, it would have probably been a major disaster. But disclosure is the important word here, because if there was a disclosure in the first place, it would have changed the whole entire outcome of this car. You see, when you sell something at auction, you have to give a disclosure. Now, it doesn't have to be super specific. You don't have to say low compression on cylinders 1 and 2. There just has to be some sort of disclosure, whether it be in the form of pictures or whether it be verbal, to let someone know what they're buying. And in the case of this Ferrari, like I told you earlier, it was listed with normal wear. I'm pretty sure the seller was able to get away with this is because this car was listed on a new pilot program with this auction where sellers were able to create their own disclosures. It used to be that you'd have to bring the car into the auction and an independent person within the auction would create the disclosure for you after looking over the car. If this Ferrari would have drove into the auction with that check engine light on the dashboard, they would have immediately marked it as a mechanically damaged car. And if I would have seen that, I would have either paid way less for it or I wouldn't have picked it up at all. At the time, I really tried to make it clear to this auction what I think had gone on here, and they pretty much ignored me. Now, I have heard over time that if you are not accurately disclosing issues with your cars, they will penalize you for it, which is good. But I was the guinea pig here. I didn't want to make a big fuss about it, especially because I work with these auctions. Sometimes I video at them, and I didn't want to ruffle any feathers, especially when I just thought we had a failed transmission and we were going to fix the car. Now that all this is in the past, I want to hear from you guys. Did I make the right decision in cutting my losses and getting rid of this burgundy Ferrari 360? Let me know down in the comments, just to give you an either or price comparison. To make this burgundy 360 a good driver would have cost me about the same amount of money we sunk into our Ferrari F430 project, the car with the big burn hole in the side that we brought pretty much back to life. That car has lower miles. It does contain a branded title, something the 360 didn't, but it is a much more desirable model that will cost you much more at a dealership. I know which car I'd rather have. have, but you guys let me know. Also, if you're not already following me on Instagram, where I'm posting updates to current projects, like what's up there on that lift before anything goes live here, just follow me or hit that link down in the description. Guys, I can't thank each and every one of you enough for watching today. I'll catch you very soon.